A worn, sepia-toned photograph of three children surfaces at an estate auction, labeled only with a year, 1952, and no names. They say photographs are memories you can hold, but some hold far more than they should. At first, the image looked harmless. Three children standing in a neat row, hands clasped, a house like any other behind them. The eldest boy's shoes were polished. The younger one wore a smile too wide for his face, and their sister's dress fluttered as though caught in a gentle breeze. It was the kind of picture you'd find tucked inside a family Bible or kept in a drawer with yellowing letters and pressed flowers. Perfectly ordinary, painfully innocent. The photograph appeared on an otherwise unremarkable Thursday afternoon, tucked between cracked leather albums and dust-coated frames on a long wooden table at an estate auction that few people attended. It was small, barely larger than a hand, printed on thick paper softened by decades of touch and air and neglect. The sepia tone had aged into something faintly amber, like trapped sap preserving something ancient within, and its edges had begun to curl as though time itself had tried to fold it closed. No one knew who had owned the house before the sale. The listing had been brief, the records sparse, and the neighbors could only offer fragments of rumor about a family that arrived quietly in town and vanished just as quietly. Still, the belongings were laid out like the remnants of someone's life dismantled piece by piece, and among them rested the photograph, unassuming but strangely magnetic. Collectors passed it by without thought, drawn instead to antique clocks and solid oak furniture. Yet the photograph remained in the historian's line of sight no matter where he moved. It seemed almost to watch him, though of course no one else glanced twice at it. It bore no caption, no handwritten note on the back, only a year scrawled in fading ink, 1952. No names, not a location. Just three children standing close together, their expressions unreadable beneath the haze of age and chemistry. They could have been siblings or strangers or ghosts of someone's past, but there was nothing to confirm it. The historian found himself wondering who had taken the picture, who had chosen not to label them, who forgot or refused to claim their faces for posterity. That absence felt louder than any story that might have been told. He lifted the photograph between two careful fingers and felt its weight, heavier than paper should feel, as if memory itself pressed against it. The auctioneer noticed his interest and drifted over, offering a tired shrug and saying the lot came from a locked drawer found in the attic, no documents with it, no family members stepping forward to explain. That detail only deepened the historian's curiosity. He imagined the drawer sealed for years, its contents kept away from sunlight and touch, waiting for a moment like this, waiting for someone to choose it. He paid a modest sum, wrapped the photograph in brown paper, and carried it home in his coat pocket, unaware that the act of claiming it had shifted something unseen. Outside, the sky dimmed earlier than usual, clouds thick as well gathering across the horizon, the air cooling with an abruptness that felt like the house itself was exhaling after being disturbed, as though whatever memory the image contained was stirring awake in the dark quiet that followed. He didn't look closely at the photograph until he brought it back to his study, where the lamplight was warm and steady, and the walls held the quiet that always made thinking easier. The historian placed the picture flat on his oak desk, took off his gloves, and leaned in with curiosity that bordered on reverence. He wanted to catalog it properly, identify the clothing styles, the material of the paper, and perhaps cross-reference the year with missing census families or forgotten school records. But something tugged at his attention before he could begin formal analysis, something that didn't align with familiarity or normal decay. At first it was only a feeling, like the faint pressure of someone's gaze at the back of his neck, a prickling intuition that urged him to look deeper. When he adjusted the lamp and the light fell evenly across the photograph, he saw it. The children stood in a row, still, composed, unremarkably posed, and yet their shadows betrayed everything. The eldest boy's shadow stretched left across the yard, long and sharp-edged like late afternoon light. The little boy beside him cast his shadow forward instead, as though the sun had moved behind the photographer. But the girl, smallest of the three, had no shadow beneath her feet at all. Instead, hers trailed faintly behind her, almost transparent, like the outline of something not fully there. It took the historian several tense seconds to realize the impossibility of it, his breath growing shallow as he tried to rationalize what he saw. Exposure glitch, damaged plate, a trick of fading chemicals. That was what he told himself. Yet the paper was intact, the image crisp enough to show the stitching on the girl's hem. He felt unsettled, not because the anomaly existed, but because it appeared intentional, designed, as though the photograph wanted to be noticed but not understood. He lifted it closer, turning it gently under the light, hoping different angles would correct the impossibility, but each shift only confirmed it. The children seemed untouched by distortion otherwise, their feet aligned with the ground, their clothes hung naturally, their eyes stared ahead with an eerie calm that felt practiced. But the shadows disobeyed the laws that governed the rest of the world, and it was that disobedience that made the historian's pulse slow to a cautious rhythm. He imagined the photographer standing there in 1952, framing the scene, either oblivious to the unnatural play of light or chillingly aware of it. A small click of the shutter, a moment frozen, and then hidden away in the dark for decades. The historian rubbed his thumb over the back of the picture, over the date written in fading ink, and wondered what kind of day could hold 3 suns, or whether the children were ever standing in the same place at all. The historian spent the next morning pacing his study, unable to shake the weight of the photograph from his mind. Every rational part of him insisted there must be an explanation simple enough to satisfy logic: damage during development, exposure anomalies, or a composite created long before anyone had the tools or reason to attempt such trickery. Still, reason alone felt thin against the unease coiled inside him. He decided then to consult someone whose eyes were trained to recognize what amateur observers ignored. He wrapped the photograph carefully, like a relic, and drove across town to a retired photography expert he knew only through academic circles, a man who had spent decades restoring photographs nearly lost to time and misfortune. The expert welcomed him with polite curiosity, but that curiosity deepened to something heavier once the photograph lay under the bright white beam of his magnifying lamp. They stood together in silence for a long time as the expert adjusted lenses, shifted angles, and murmured measurements to himself. He examined fiber texture, emulsions, chemical residue, normal steps, though his hands moved more cautiously than usual, as though he sensed something alive beneath the paper. The historian watched the older man's expression change with each incremental observation, watched confidence bleed into confusion, watched the polite curiosity fade entirely. When the expert finally spoke, his voice was quiet, like someone afraid to disturb something unseen. He noted the consistency of natural outdoor light, the evenness of shadow fall across the landscape behind the children, the clear evidence that this photograph was taken outside in a single moment. Yet the shadows on the children contradicted every certainty he had ever built his career upon. 3 light directions meant 3 sources, but no artificial lighting rig existed in 1952 capable of achieving such precision outside, without leaving equipment or glare visible. And even if such a rig existed, the expert added, it would require power lines, cables, and planning no amateur family photo would justify. The historian felt the room grow still as the expert continued, saying there were no seams, no overlays, no signs of double exposure, no tampering, no trick. The photograph was authentic, and that truth was more unsettling than forgery could ever be. The expert leaned back, pale beneath the lamplight, and confessed that in his 40 years of examining images, he had never encountered one that defied physics so quietly, so elegantly, without a single mistake to betray manipulation. It was as though the children stood under 3 suns in a world where only one existed, or as though each child occupied a slightly different moment in time and the camera caught them all anyway. The historian gathered the photo with slow hands, feeling a chill trace his spine as he realized that authenticity did not make the image safer. It made it infinitely more dangerous, because something impossible had happened once, and photographs, by nature, were proof rather than imagination. The photograph became heavier in meaning the longer the historian held on to it, as if every layer of discovery only deepened the mystery rather than clarifying it. He wanted facts, dates, names, anything that could tether the image to reality. Curiosity alone no longer drove him. Unease did, thudding steadily in his chest like a second heartbeat. He decided to involve technology, something cold and objective, something incapable of superstition or suggestion. With permission from a colleague at a nearby university, he fed a high-resolution scan of the photograph into a facial recognition program typically reserved for archival police work and historical identification. The process was meticulous. He cleaned the scan, adjusted contrast, and isolated each child's face individually as though peeling them apart from one another. The computer word, evaluating features, angles, bone structure, the quiet mathematics of identity. The results began appearing on the monitor one by one, and with each match the historian felt the temperature in the room shift. The eldest boy's likeness aligned with a missing child from Ohio, last reported seen in 1933, 20 years before the photograph's marked date. His file contained a single school portrait, a scribbled note about a summer disappearance, and a grieving family that eventually moved west, leaving behind a cold case that never warmed. The algorithm marked it as a high-confidence match, percentages blinking bright and undeniable. The second boy, the one with the too wide smile, matched a child reported missing in Louisiana in 1971, nearly 2 decades after the photo should have been taken, a boy who vanished during a church picnic and was never found despite statewide searches. The girl, delicate, lace-collared, barely a shadow, matched a child missing from a Massachusetts orphanage in 1908, who according to records was declared dead by winter's end. Her body never recovered. The historian stared at the screen, breath stalled in his lungs, watching time collapse into a single frame no larger than a postcard. It was impossible. The children could not coexist, could not stand shoulder to shoulder beneath the same sky. They belonged to different years, different tragedies, different histories that never touched. Yet there they stood, alive, preserved, smiling faintly beneath the sepia surface. The historian ran the scan again and again, hoping for error, but the software repeated its verdict with unwavering certainty. 3 missing children. 3 separate decades. One photograph dated 1952. Logic strained against the revelation like wood under frost, ready to crack. Instead of answers, he now held confirmation of something far more disturbing, that the photograph was not a memory captured in time, but a vessel that gathered pieces of lost years, binding them together in defiance of chronology. The screen glowed softly, cold and unwavering, as though it too was staring back at him, waiting for him to understand that this image was not documenting the past. It was collecting it. The historian told himself he would stop for the night. He said it aloud, even shut the laptop for a moment. But the silence that followed felt too deep, too expectant, as if the room itself waited for him to continue. Despite the weight of what he had already uncovered, he opened the computer again, unable to ignore the feeling that the photograph had more to reveal. The expert's technical report and the facial recognition results lay scattered across the desk like pieces of something unfinished. With a slow inhale, he raised the digital scan once more, this time increasing sharpness beyond what an ordinary viewer would consider useful, then adjusting exposure, contrast, depth curves, peeling the image apart layer by layer like a surgeon unearthing bone beneath skin. He wasn't looking for anything specific, only seeking clarity in a picture that had already defied understanding. At first, nothing changed except the grain becoming more pronounced, the edges crisper, the children's features more defined. But as he continued to refine the shadows behind them, a murky shape began to shift into focus, subtle as a breath on cold glass. He frowned, leaning closer, magnifying again. There, positioned just behind the 3 children, was the suggestion of a dark form, taller than all of them and partially obscured by the house's porch beams. It had been so faint in the original that the eye never lingered on it, like a peripheral ghost. But now it stood undeniable, a 4th presence among the children where there should have been none. The historian's pulse stuttered as he locked onto the emerging details, the faint outline of a high collar, a long coat tapered at the waist, clothing that belonged not to the mid-20th century, but to a much earlier time. Late 1800s, perhaps earlier still. The silhouette carried an old-world stiffness, a posture too deliberate to be an accident. He zoomed further, isolating the shape until the children faded and only the shadowed figure remained. Even then its edges resisted definition, as if the camera had captured the idea of someone rather than a person fully present. Yet the fabric texture was real, buttons running down the coat's front were real, and the brim of what might have been a hat curved sharply against the background light. Most disturbing was the suggestion of a face, blurred, nearly smudged into the photograph like the photographer had tried to wipe it away. But if one stared long enough, there seemed to be the pale impression of eyes watching from beneath the shade. Not shining, not visible exactly, but felt, as though attention pressed back through decades of chemical emulsion. The historian sat frozen, aware that this fourth figure did not belong with the others, did not belong to the time stamped on the back, and yet its presence felt older than all three children combined. A guardian, a collector, or something stranger still. It had hidden in plain sight until dragged forward by technology, as if it had been waiting for someone to notice, waiting for the photograph to be opened like a door through which it might step again into the world. The revelation of the fourth figure made stillness impossible. Sleep eluded the historian for 2 nights, his thoughts circling the image like moths around a flame that burned without consuming. The house behind the children, once a vague shape softened by age, now demanded his attention with unnerving urgency. Its architecture, narrow porch railings, 3-pane window, steep pitched roof, felt familiar in a way he couldn't explain, like a word lingering at the edge of memory. He scoured archives, maps, property records, searching for any house with matching features, until at last he found an old census photo from 1951 that mirrored the structure in detail. The address lay in a rural town 3 hours away, a place with fewer than 200 residents living among long fields and quiet roads. He drove there with the photograph wrapped carefully in its envelope, the way one might carry something fragile or dangerous. The town welcomed him with wary eyes and a chill that clung even beneath spring sunlight. When he asked about the house, shopkeepers grew quiet, their faces creasing like paper folded along an old crease. Some pretended not to hear him. Others shook their heads and muttered that it was better forgotten. An elderly woman sweeping the front of a small general store was the first to answer him directly. Her voice trembled with something older than fear, the kind of knowledge etched into memory through experience rather than rumor. She told him he did not want to see that place, not if he valued rest or reason or the thin barrier that kept the past from looking directly back. Her hand tightened around her broom, and she lowered her voice to warn him that people disappeared from that house, long before he was born and long after it should have been torn down. Curiosity and dread braided together inside him until neither could be separated. He insisted, gently, that he only wished to examine it, that history deserved clarity even when uncomfortable. The woman looked at him with pity more than caution and told him one final thing. Never approach after dark, because the house changed when the sun went down, as though it woke from its slumber and remembered who once stood within its walls. Others echoing her warning appeared throughout the day. A gas station attendant who avoided eye contact, a young woman who crossed herself when he mentioned the porch, a man who offered to lead him there only if he visited before dusk and left before the first shadow touched the door. By the time he reached the overgrown road that wound toward the abandoned property, the envelope felt warm in his pocket, as though the photograph recognized its birthplace and pulsed with recognition like a heartbeat, steady and waiting. The house waited at the end of a narrowing road, half swallowed by tall grass and trees that leaned inward like witnesses unwilling to speak. The historian parked beneath an arch of branches where daylight thinned and approached the porch slowly, cautious not to disturb the stillness. The boards groaned under his weight, brittle from years of weather, but the house did not collapse or resist. It seemed instead to breathe in his presence, as though his arrival was expected after decades of silence. He paused at the front door, noting the faded paint and rusting hinges. But what unsettled him most was the faint impression of children's handprints on the wood, small, overlapping, as if placed there at different times by different hands. The door opened with a reluctant sigh when he pushed. Dust swam through the stale air, illuminated by threads of light filtering through broken shutters. The interior smelled of old paper and damp floors, the kind of scent that lingered long after memory decayed. He walked through the narrow hallway, walls lined with peeling wallpaper patterned with faded roses, until he reached a room at the back where a broken window let wind curl through like a whisper. It was there, atop a collapsed wooden trunk, that he saw the first photograph. The same porch, the same angle, the same spot where the three children once stood. But these children were different, two boys and a girl, dressed in clothing that appeared from the 1920s, and behind them stood the shadow figure, sharper here, more defined, a presence not easily overlooked. He didn't want to touch the photo, yet his hand moved without permission, lifting it carefully as though it might crumble. Beneath it lay another, then another, an entire stack of images bound only by age and a thin layer of dust. Each photo captured different children, never the same faces twice, spanning decades. Victorian collars, Depression-era knickers, post-war dresses, and always they stood in that same place on the porch, eyes forward, expressions unreadable. And always, behind them, stood the watcher. Sometimes he was barely visible, shrouded in dusk or shadow. Other times his outline cut through the frame with chilling clarity, tall and still, his presence like a pillar rooting the children where they stood. The historian flipped through photo after photo, his pulse quickening as he realized the pattern stretched far beyond the three faces he had studied at home. This was not one anomaly. It was a ritual, repeated again and again. His breath trembled as he counted. 12 photographs, then 20, then more buried at the bottom of the trunk. Decades captured by a single camera, or perhaps something older than a device, something that harvested moments across time like fruit plucked from separate seasons. The walls around him creaked softly, like footsteps settling into place. The historian could no longer deny what the stack suggested. The children were chosen, placed, and preserved, and the figure behind them did not change because he was never meant to. Each photograph felt like a recording, a claim, a quiet warning that what had happened once would happen again, and perhaps already was. The historian's breath grew shallow as he studied the stack of photographs fanned across the dusty floorboards. The more he examined them, the more obvious the truth became. These children did not belong together, not in life and not in time. Their smiles were brittle, their poses identical like figures arranged rather than caught mid-moment. They were dressed from different eras like museum pieces, stitched into the same frozen tableau by a hand that cared nothing for chronology or reason. The realization seeped into the room like cold water rising under a door. None of the children in these images could have stood side by side in reality. They never shared the same year, the same century in some cases. They were plucked from their lives, removed like pages torn from separate books, and held in a single image by the same unseen author. He turned to the original photograph again, looking with new clarity at the faces he had once believed belonged to siblings. They looked nothing alike now, not in bone structure or gaze or posture. They were bound only by proximity, arranged neatly by someone who wanted them still. Someone patient. Someone who waited through decades to continue collecting. His pulse thundered in his ears as he looked at the shadowed figure more closely, understanding at last what the presence implied. Not a parent, not a guardian, but something older than those roles, a curator selecting children the way one selects artifacts, preserving them in images so time could not erode them. The house was no ruin, it was a gallery. The wind shifted behind him, dragging a sigh through the halls, rustling paper like whispers trying to rise. The historian froze, every instinct sharpening into survival. In the kitchen doorway he heard a soft sound, faint but unmistakable, the slow creak of footsteps crossing old boards, spaced with the rhythm of something deliberate. Not the house settling, not an animal, something walking toward him with patience, unhurried, confident he would not flee. His hand tightened around the photograph, though he could not say why, whether for evidence or protection, or because part of him already felt claimed. In the silence that followed, a camera shutter cracked through the air, sharp, mechanical, final. The sound did not come from his own device. It echoed through the house like the punctuation of a sentence unfinished, like a promise renewed. He turned, heart hammering against bone, knowing before he saw that he was no longer alone, that something had stepped from frame into room, continuing the collection. The photograph in his hand felt warm, pulsing like a heartbeat, as though it too was awakening to welcome its next subject.